Picture the scene: he struts out onto the platform ready to perform when out of nowhere a member of the road crew sprints onto the set and wallops him with a heavy 2x4. It was absolute madness. You have to ask yourself what on earth was going through his head. Naturally, that was our cue to cue up the ominous, spine-chilling soundtracks. Let's be honest, the Prince of Darkness didn't just participate in the music industry. He grabbed it by the throat and shook it until it paid attention. For decades, critics and naysayers placed their bets on his failure. They criticised his chaotic lifestyle, his unique vocal delivery, and the sheer audacity with which he shattered the boundaries of what rock and roll could be. But simply crediting him with forming one of the most significant bands in history doesn't do the man justice. He practically took the raw clay of the genre and sculpted it into the heavy metal monster we recognise today. However, to label him merely a musician is a massive understatement. This is a man who struck genuine fear into the hearts of suburban parents and stiff politicians, embodying a level of rebellion that terrified the establishment. Yet millions of fans didn't just watch, they welcomed the absolute bedlam with open arms. However, fame is a double-edged sword. For every artist who worshipped the ground Ozzy walked on, there were certainly a handful of individuals that the Black Sabbath frontman simply could not stomach. So let's crack open the files and see who landed on the madman's personal enemies list. First up on the chopping block, Bill Ward. The feud between Ozzy and Bill Ward isn't just a disagreement, it is a legendary saga of bitterness that cuts deeper than any other rivalry in a rock history. You have to remember where they came from. When Ozzy Bill, Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler banded together in late 60s Birmingham, they were just four broke working-class lads turning the gloom and frustration of post-war England into a sound the universe had never experienced. And make no mistake, Bill Ward's thunderous jazzy percussion was the engine driving that heavy metal machine. Without Ward behind the kit, Sabbath didn't just lose a timekeeper. They lost their very soul. For decades, Ozzy and Bill were in the trenches together, surviving every disaster imaginable. They endured crushing poverty, severe addiction battles, firings, awkward reunions, near-death experiences, and societal outrage. They were more than bandmates. They were brothers forged in the fire of chaos. That deep history is exactly why when the band geared up for their grand finale in early 2010, the entire fan base assumed the original Four Horsemen would ride off into the sunset together one last time. Instead of a fairy tale ending, the whole situation imploded in spectacular fashion. By 2011, when the reunion album and massive world tour were announced, the cracks were already turning into canyons. Behind closed doors, Bill Ward was handed a contract that he later described as completely unworkable, claiming it stripped him of his dignity and offered zero respect to him as a founding father of the group. From Ward's point of view, he was being treated like a hired hand rather than a legend who was owed his due. But if you asked Ozzy, the narrative was spun in a completely different direction. According to the frontman, the elephant in the room wasn't the legal paperwork or the money, it was Bill's health. In a series of brutally honest and somewhat savage public statements, Ozzy openly questioned whether his old friend had the physical stamina to survive the grueling schedule of an album cycle and a global trek. He brought up Ward's history of heart attacks and hospital visits, going as far as to say he didn't want the guilt of Bill collapsing and dying on his watch during a performance. Suddenly, the fans were caught in the crossfire, unsure whether to believe the business dispute or the health concerns. By the time 2015 rolled around, the Cold War went nuclear. Bill Ward released a massive statement refusing to return unless the Prince of Darkness apologised for what he deemed comprised of lies and character assassination. Ozzy never one to back down from a fight, fired back with equal ferocity. In a Facebook post that left the metal community reeling, he dismissed Ward's complaints about the contract as nothing more than a smokescreen to hide the truth. He accused his old drummer of playing the victim card and bluntly stated that the band moved on simply because they didn't believe Ward was physically up to the task anymore. That specific moment marked the point of no return. It was a tragic public divorce between two men who invented heavy metal, now speaking to each other through press releases like bitter strangers. The Sabbath machine rolled on without its heartbeat, recording the album Psalm 13 with Brad Wilk and touring the globe, but it was essentially a reunion with an asterisk. Even with the stadium sold out, the die-hard fans couldn't shake the feeling that a vital piece of the puzzle was missing. Of course, what happens backstage is often darker. There was immense pressure from insurance companies and promoters, the boring corporate reality that fans rarely think about. The reunion tour was insured for tens of millions of dollars, and rumour has it that Ward's medical chart set off major alarms for the underwriters. While Ozzy painted his objections as personal concern for a friend, critics argued he allowed corporate anxieties and logistical fears to morph into public insults against a man who had already survived more trauma than most rock stars ever dream of. And for the frontman, that resentment didn't just fade away, it festered for years. While Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler publicly expressed hope that the bridges could be mended, the relationship between the singer and the drummer remained frozen in that ugly, unresolved state. There was never a public apology. The grand reconciliation that everyone hoped for simply never materialised. Consequently, the original Black Sabbath lineup never graced the stage together again. In heartbreaking interviews later on, Ward admitted he spent years waiting for Ozzy to reach out privately, but the phone never rang. And while Ozzy continued to preach about brotherhood and legacy to the press, his silence toward his old friend spoke volumes louder than any insult ever could. For the legions of metalheads, the real tragedy isn't just that Bill Ward missed the final curtain call. It is the heartbreaking reality that the man who once considered Ozzy his brother was left without closure. Moving on to entry number 2, Bruce Dickinson. Now, Dickinson was the operatic voice of Iron Maiden, one of the most disciplined, respected, and fiercely independent outfits the genre ever produced. For years, these two titans existed in parallel universes, and there was absolutely no reason to suspect that he and Ozzy Osbourne would ever lock horns, that is, until 2005. That summer, Ozfest was designed to be a glorious victory lap celebrating not just Ozzy, but the entire culture of heavy metal. Launched back in 1996 by Ozzy and the formidable Sharon Osbourne, the festival was the ultimate proving ground. It was supposed to be the crowning jewel of Ozzy's legacy. He didn't just use the platform to breathe new life into his own floundering career. He became a saviour for the underground scene, dragging obscure acts into the blinding limelight and keeping the heavy metal heart beating in a music business that would have happily left it for dead. Stepping onto the Ozfest stage meant you were entering the Prince of Darkness's personal kingdom, performing under his flag to his loyal legions, which is precisely why the chaos that followed was such a monumental betrayal of the unwritten code. The organisers pulled out all the stops by bringing in Iron Maiden as a massive co-headliner, effectively putting two distinct dynasties of metal royalty side by side to share the glory. In theory, this should have been the ultimate celebration of rock history, a victory lap for the genre's titans. But behind the curtain, it was slowly curdling into one of the most bitter and public spats the heavy metal world had ever witnessed. The bad blood didn't take long to simmer. In fact, the tension in the air was palpable from the very first chord. Every single evening, Bruce Dickinson reportedly turned his microphone into a weapon, using his stage time to fire verbal volleys, not only at the festival's sound system, but more shockingly, straight at the man whose name was on the ticket, Ozzy. Reports from the tour suggest he was relentlessly taking the mickey out of Ozzy for needing a teleprompter to remember lyrics trash-talking the family's reality TV fame and loudly proclaiming that a proper band like Iron Maiden didn't need cheap reality show gimmicks or endless farewell tours to matter. That kind of talk was more than just banter. It was crossing a serious professional line, especially considering Iron Maiden was pocketing a massive paycheck and receiving top-tier treatment from the organisers. Here was Ozzy effectively signing the checks and hosting the party, only to be publicly undressed and humiliated night after night on his very own tour. Perhaps the most stinging detail of the whole sorry saga is that for quite a while Ozzy was completely in the dark, oblivious to the insults being hurled his way. The Prince of Darkness later revealed that not a single soul had the heart to tell him Bruce had been properly slagging him off every night. When the truth finally reached him, he wasn't just angry, he was genuinely baffled and hurt by the venom. For a veteran like Ozzy, taking a bit of criticism comes with the territory, but this wasn't about a difference of opinion, it was about a flagrant lack of public respect. He maintained that if Dickinson had a genuine grievance, he should have manned up and said it to his face like an adult, rather than resorting to what Ozzy saw as playground tactics and childish behaviour. The simmering pot finally boiled over on August 20th, 2005 during the tour's final stop at the San Bernardino's Glen Helen Pavilion in California, a night that would go down in infamy. Sharon Osbourne decided she had heard enough and launched a counter-offensive. By her own admission, she rallied a group of loyalists in the front rows, armed them with eggs leftovers and trash, and gave the order to bombard Iron Maiden the moment they stepped on stage. To add injury to insult, the band found themselves battling mysterious technical gremlins with the PA system cutting out at the most inconvenient moments. As the British legends tried to power through their set list, they were met with a relentless hail of raw eggs and random projectiles raining down on them from the pit. Bruce Dickinson, absolutely livid but refusing to back down, paused mid-song to call out the sabotage for what it was, rallying his troops and pushing through the performance with pure, unadulterated rage. The tens of thousands in attendance were left completely gobsmacked. While some were impressed by Maiden's stiff upper lip and refusal to quit, others were simply appalled by the pettiness unfolding before their eyes. Once the music died down, Sharon marched onto the stage herself, seizing the mic to mock Dickinson one last time and issuing a stark warning that no one disrespects the Osbourne clan and gets away with it. She might have expected a victory lap, but instead she was drowned out by a chorus of boos, with a significant chunk of the audience walking out in protest before Black Sabbath even played a single note. The entire evening had descended into a complete and utter shambles, a nightmare scenario for everyone involved. Away from the mob, in the quiet of the backstage area, Iron Maiden's bassist and founder Steve Harris reportedly sought out Ozzy to offer a personal apology for his frontman's antagonistic antics. This little detail is crucial because it proves that the rest of the Maiden camp knew a line had been crossed. However, amidst all the drama, people often forget to ask why Bruce felt the need to start firing shots in the first place. You have to remember that Bruce has always fancied himself as the thinking man's metalhead, an intellectual outsider who doubles as a commercial airline captain. A published author, a competitive fencer, and a vocal critic of anything he perceives as lazy or complacent within the rock and roll ecosystem. In his worldview, Iron Maiden stood for hard graft, self-reliance and musical integrity, whereas Ozzfest represented everything he despised: cheap celebrity spectacle, triumphing over artistic substance. But where did the Prince of Darkness himself actually stand amidst all this mudslinging? Despite being the centre of the storm, Ozzy has always maintained that the egg-throwing ambush wasn't his master plan. While he stood by Sharon as a loyal husband, he made it abundantly clear he never wanted the feud to get that ugly. For him, the principle was simple. You don't take the gig, cash the cheque, and then stand on the host table and insult him. That was simply unforgivable bad manners. Ozzy was cut from a different cloth, coming from a rough and tumble generation where showing respect wasn't just a courtesy, it was a survival mechanism. He hadn't built Ozzfest just to stroke his own ego, but to serve as a vital lifeline for heavy bands that the mainstream industry had left to rot, so he didn't view Bruce's rants as speaking truth to power. There was a much deeper, more personal wound festering there too, as Ozzy had spent decades battling to be respected as a serious musician rather than just a caricature or a punchline. By the time 2005 rolled around, he was painfully self-aware of how the tabloids and the general public viewed him. Bruce's onstage jibes weren't just playful teasing, they were reinforcing every negative stereotype that Ozzy had spent his entire career trying to shake off. That is precisely why the insults cut him to the bone. Bruce Dickinson, on the other hand, would later brush the whole incident off, dismissing it as nothing more than a storm in a teacup. While he did tip his hat to the monumental legacy of Black Sabbath, he never actually offered a direct personal apology to the man he'd insulted. That lack of a proper resolution is exactly why this old wound has never truly had the chance to heal over. Even years down the line, Sharon would still unleash verbal fury on Dickinson whenever asked, while Ozzy adopted a calmer but equally firm position, admitting Bruce was a phenomenal vocalist, while bluntly noting that he just wasn't a very nice bloke. Moving on to number 3, we have Bob Daisley. Now, Ozzy Osbourne's falling out with Daisley was a much quieter affair, but don't let the silence fool you, it was far more toxic. You see, Bob Daisley wasn't just a hired gun passing through Ozzy's orbit, he was the absolute backbone of the Madman's solo resurrection. When Ozzy was unceremoniously booted from Black Sabbath back in 1979, practically everyone in the music business had already written his obituary. He was viewed as a liability, a self-destructive train wreck who was completely washed up, but Daisley saw something different. He saw a wounded genius who still had plenty of fire in his belly, simply needing the right squad in his corner to survive the storm. And make no mistake, it was Bob Daisley who laid the bricks and mortar for the empire that Ozzy would build next. It was Daisley who acted as the linchpin connecting Ozzy with the guitar prodigy Randy Rhoads and insisting they recruit only world-class musicians to back them up. He was instrumental in assembling what was originally intended to be a democratic band called the Blizzard of Oz, and he co-wrote the very anthems that would resurrect Ozzy's career from the ashes. The resulting albums, specifically Blizzard of Ozzy and Diary of a Madman, didn't just enjoy commercial success, they became the blueprint for 80s metal. They built an absolute empire that defined the genre for a generation. And if you peeled back the layers, Bob Daisley's fingerprints were all over the master tapes. We're talking about the pulsating bass lines, the intricate arrangements, the lyrics, and the fundamental song structures that made those tracks iconic. However, while the music was soaring, something toxic was brewing behind the velvet curtain. As soon as Ozzy's career found its footing, the management dynamic shifted drastically, with Sharon Osbourne stepping in to take the reins. Almost immediately, the creative vision was overhauled. What had started as a collaborative band of brothers was swiftly rebranded as a solo vehicle for a single star, pushing everyone else into the shadows. The credit began to shrink. Royalties became incredibly murky. And by 1981, both Daisley and drummer Lucas Lake were unceremoniously fired. They were slowly erased from the narrative, their names scrubbed from sleeves, their contributions minimised, and history effectively rewritten. What followed wasn't just a disagreement, it became one of the longest, ugliest and most exhausting legal battles in the history of heavy metal, dragging on for decades. Daisley and Kerslake sued for their rightful unpaid royalties and proper accreditation, actually winning a significant early court case in the mid-1980s that validated their claims. But the real rupture happened later when they discovered that the Osbournes had purchased the rights to Ozzy's back catalogue and were allegedly pocketing performance royalties that should have gone to the original songwriters and musicians. The lawsuits dragged on interminably, bleeding both sides of energy and money, turning former bandmates into bitter courtroom adversaries for years on end. Then, in 2002, the conflict reached its absolute nadir, a move so petty it remains infamous in rock lore. The Osbournes re-released Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman with completely new bass and drum tracks, re-recorded by hired guns, literally deleting Daisley and Kerslake's original performances from the record. For the fan base, it was a shocking act of vandalism. For Daisley, it was devastating, not just a personal insult, but a desecration of Randy Rhoads' legacy and the artistic integrity of the albums they created together. From Ozzy's camp, the dispute was painted as a case of harassment and obsession, portraying the musicians as disgruntled employees who couldn't let go. From Daisley's perspective, the issue was crystal clear and strictly business. We were never paid what we were contractually owed. That is precisely where the bitterness hardened into something concrete. It is a profound shame because Daisley was a songwriter in the truest sense of the word. He helped shape the melodies, the structures and the lyrical themes during a period when Ozzy was emotionally unstable and creatively fragile. As Sharon Osbourne consolidated her iron grip on control, The shift wasn't merely managerial or administrative. It was entirely philosophical. The Ozzy Osbourne brand became centralised, streamlined and fiercely protected as a corporate entity rather than an artistic collective. Viewed through that corporate lens, contributors like Daisley weren't seen as essential collaborators anymore. They were viewed as liabilities and financial drains on the bottom line. The cleaner the hero narrative, the easier it was to sell the product, and Bob Daisley's lingering presence and legal claims complicated that polished narrative significantly. Ozzy, often caught in the crossfire between loyalty to his wife and a desire to distance himself from the gritty details, framed the lawsuits as harassment. But Daisley never framed it as revenge. He framed it purely as a matter of survival. He had children to feed, bills to pay, and a mortgage to cover. He had a body of work that continued to generate massive amounts of money worldwide without a cent reaching his pocket. In his mind, simply walking away and accepting the theft was impossible. And yet, here is the twist that changes the complexion of the entire story. When Ozzy Osbourne passed away in July 2025, Bob Daisley didn't speak with anger or resentment. He spoke with profound grief. Daisley openly admitted that the news of Ozzy's death brought him to tears, washing away the decades of animosity. He reminisced about the laughter, the spark of creativity, and the strange magic they shared in the studio during those early years. He referred to their work together as a monumental achievement that would outlive all of them. He mentioned that the depth of sadness he felt surprised him, and in the end, all he could focus on were the fond memories of their time together. Sadly enough, these two giants just couldn't resolve their differences while Ozzy was still alive. Now let's move to rival number 4, Ronnie James Dio. When Ozzy Osbourne was fired from Black Sabbath in 1979, it wasn't just a job loss. It was the end of his identity. Being the frontman of Sabbath was the only thing that had ever defined his existence. And when the band decided to move on without him, Ozzy took it personally, suffering a deep psychological wound that never truly healed. Then Sabbath went out and hired Ronnie James Dio. The problem for Ozzy was that Dio wasn't just an Ozzy sound-alike or a temporary placeholder. He was, by most technical standards, a definitively better vocalist, a powerhouse who could command the stage and hold his own in a legendary band like that. Dio fronted Sabbath on the Heaven and Hell album, and it was a massive success, both critically and commercially. The band sounded renewed, sharper and more focused than they had in years. To Ozzy, this success was the ultimate insult. The band he truly believed could not exist without him had not only survived his departure, but they were actually thriving. That is where the deep-seated bitterness truly began to fester. Ozzy lashed out publicly and viciously, dismissing the Dio-era Sabbath as illegitimate and accusing the band of merely living off the legacy of his songs. When both camps released live albums in 1982, Ozzy's Speak of the Devil and Sabbath's Live Evil, Ozzy accused them of deliberately trying to sabotage his release and steal his thunder. He went nuclear in the press, mocking the band at every opportunity and minimising Dio's role. But behind the scenes, things were even uglier than the headlines suggested. According to Sharon Osbourne, Ozzy's first real in-person encounter with Dio nearly turned physically violent. In a shocking revelation from the 2025 documentary, Ozzy Osbourne: No Escape from Now the Truth came out. Sharon claimed that Ozzy, drunk, furious and riddled with insecurity, actually tried to stab Dio with a dinner fork during their first chance meeting at the Rainbow Bar in Los Angeles. It sounds completely absurd, but it perfectly captures Ozzy's mindset at the time. He didn't know Dio personally. He refused to listen to his records. He simply didn't want to know. To Ozzy, Dio wasn't a human being. He was a hated symbol, the living proof that Black Sabbath could move forward into the future without him. Dio was the antithesis of Ozzy. He didn't stumble through interviews or rely on a reputation for chaos. He spoke carefully, chose his words with deliberate precision, and treated heavy metal as something almost mythological and majestic rather than autobiographical and messy. That fundamental contrast was everything. Ozzy's deep connection to his legion of fans was forged in the fires of raw vulnerability and sheer survival instinct, whereas Dio's command of the stage was built on technical power and icy precision. While Ozzy seemed to bleed his soul out on the stage, exposing every flaw, Dio stood before the crowd like a mystical general, tall, invincible and untouchable. For the heavy metal faithful, the shift didn't just feel like a change, it felt like a necessary Darwinian evolution. However, Ozzy clearly viewed the situation differently, seeing it not as progress but as a usurper taking his throne. Dio, for his part, maintained a far more composed and gentlemanly exterior, yet underneath that calm surface lay a steel backbone that was definitely not passive. When Ozzy loudly proclaimed to the press that Black Sabbath was effectively dead without his presence, Dio didn't scream back. Instead, he responded with a chilling, icy precision that cut deeper than any shout could. He meticulously pointed out that the band had actually progressed into more complex musical territories, subtly suggesting that Ozzy's bitterness stemmed from either a refusal to grow or a simple incapacity to evolve with the times. In one particularly legendary interview, Dio didn't hold back characterising his predecessor as intellectually lacking and devoid of musical discipline, waving away Ozzy's attacks by claiming that fighting back would be like duelling with an unarmed man. Dio walked into Black Sabbath fully aware of the colossal shadow he was stepping into, and he deeply resented being treated like an unwanted guest or a temporary interloper rather than the true collaborator he was. From Ronnie's vantage point, the constant barrage of attacks coming from the Osbourne camp felt less like professional critiques and more like personal insults delivered from a place of deeply wounded pride. That context explains precisely why a man as articulate as Dio chose to respond with such dangerously sharp and cutting language. He wasn't necessarily looking to emerge victorious in a fight he deemed beneath him, primarily because he saw no valid reason for the conflict to exist. But here is the fascinating plot twist that most casual observers completely overlook. Despite the vicious war of words that played out in the magazines, this was not destined to be an eternal blood feud. As the decades rolled on and the fires of youth dimmed, the intensity of Ozzy's anger began to soften significantly. By the time the new millennium arrived in the 2000s, Ozzy started to change his tune, offering a grudging admission at first that perhaps Dio had actually done a respectable job keeping the Sabbath legacy alive. He eventually went even further, conceding that bringing in a vocalist who was the polar opposite of himself was likely the most brilliant strategic move the band could have possibly made at that time. And following Dio's tragic passing in 2010, all animosity evaporated as Ozzy declared that the world of metal had lost one of its absolute greatest voices. In his own final years, according to his wife Sharon, Ozzy spent hours watching old interviews of Dio online. In those quiet moments, it dawned on him that he had never truly taken the time to know the man he had spent so many decades actively resenting. Number 5 brings us to Roger Waters. In the pantheon of rock rivalries, few feel as deeply fundamental, intensely personal and utterly irreconcilable as the slow-burning hostility between Ozzy Osbourne and Roger Waters. This conflict was never about trivial matters like Billboard charts, ticket sales figures, or even subjective differences in musical taste alone. It was a clash of entire worldviews, a philosophical divide that eventually detonated into something far uglier than a typical celebrity spat. By the time Ozzy reached the twilight of his life, he had largely made peace with his past and let go of most ancient feuds. Yet there remained one singular figure who never managed to earn even a shred of Ozzy's respect. Not as a fellow musician, not as a creative peer, and certainly not as a decent human being. That man was unequivocally Roger Waters. On a superficial level, Ozzy Osbourne and Roger Waters shared almost nothing aside from geography and global fame. Ozzy was a product of the grim factories of Birmingham, loud, chaotic, and driven by pure gut-level instinct. His music was never crafted to lecture the masses or explain the universe. It was raw, unadulterated emotion, a mechanism for unfiltered survival and a primal howl for every outsider who felt they didn't belong. Conversely, Waters, the conceptual mastermind behind Pink Floyd, occupied the completely opposite end of the artistic spectrum. He was meticulous, deeply political, intensely intellectual, and inherently confrontational. His body of work didn't just invite interpretation, it practically demanded it. Where Ozzy's art demanded you to feel, Waters never ceased insisting that true art should instruct. Ozzy never claimed to be a scholar, while Waters never stopped acting like the schoolmaster. That vast philosophical chasm simmered quietly in the background for decades, mostly remaining unspoken until the boiling point finally arrived in the year 2025. For 40 years, Ozzy had privately dismissed Waters as a pretentious and joyless figure, viewing him as someone who believed rock and roll was a vehicle for instruction rather than human connection. Still, despite these strong convictions, Ozzy largely kept those biting thoughts to himself. He actually admired the sonic landscapes of Pink Floyd, but he had zero affection for Waters as a person, and he refused to transform that personal distaste into a media circus. However, all that dignified restraint completely evaporated in 2025. In the months immediately following Ozzy's passing on July 22nd, 2025, Waters sat down for an interview in which he spoke about the late Black Sabbath frontman with a level of palpable contempt that shocked even his harshest critics. He cruelly mocked Ozzy's intelligence, sneering at the very qualities that made the Prince of Darkness beloved. He dismissed Ozzy's entire life journey as mere idiocy and nonsense, openly stating that he had absolutely no regard for his music whatsoever. These comments crossed a sacred line simply because Roger Waters was firing shots at a man who could no longer defend himself. Naturally, the Osbourne family retaliated in full nuclear force. Sharon Osbourne, who had spent a lifetime fiercely shielding her husband from critics and opportunists alike, did not hold back a single inch. She painted a picture of Waters as a bitter, irrelevant old man who was completely devoid of basic humanity and grace. Ozzy's children were even more blunt and direct in their counterattack. Kelly Osbourne flatly condemned his character, while Jack Osbourne took the battle straight to social media, reminding the world that his father had always harboured a dislike for Waters, but had chosen the high road of silence out of sheer principle. Throughout his chaotic career, Ozzy had certainly feuded with plenty of bandmates, managers and replacement singers. But those past fights were messy, loud and usually mutual. This situation was different. It was one-sided, vindictive, and in the eyes of the global fan base, unnecessarily cruel. The public backlash against Waters intensified rapidly because his behaviour fit an all too familiar pattern. By this stage, he had already alienated former bandmates, clashed publicly with music critics, and drawn sharp condemnation from legendary peers like David Gilmour, not to mention Gilmour's wife, Polly Sampson, who had previously accused Waters of being entirely consumed by a toxic mix of resentment and inflated ego. Against that dramatic backdrop, his callous comments about Ozzy felt less like a moment of honesty and more like a desperate attempt to provoke attention one last time. Number 6, Tony Iommi. This stands as perhaps the most uncomfortable and complicated name on Ozzy Osbourne's unspoken blacklist. This specific feud wasn't notable merely because it was louder or more volatile than the rest, but because the roots of the animosity ran profoundly deep. You have to understand that Tony Iommi wasn't just another industry figure Ozzy Osbourne clashed with. He was the looming shadow Ozzy could never quite outrun. Iommi was the architect of the riffs, the unshakable backbone of the group, and frequently the man Ozzy held in the highest contempt. To the outside observer, they appeared to be inseparable legends. They were viewed as the twin pillars of Black Sabbath, the undisputed godfathers who birthed heavy metal into existence. However, stripping away the decades of mythology reveals a relationship constructed not on brotherhood, but on sheer friction. It was a cold partnership forged by necessity, survival instincts, and blind ambition, completely devoid of genuine warmth. Crucially, this toxic dynamic didn't begin in a recording studio or on a tour bus. It began with pure, unadulterated hatred. Legendary bassist Geezer Butler paints a grim picture of their youth, noting that Ozzy and Tony absolutely despised one another as teenagers navigating the rough streets of Birmingham. They attended the same school, where Tony reportedly bullied Ozzy without mercy. In Ozzy's memory, Iommi was the stuff of nightmares, physically imposing, emotionally cold, and utterly dismissive of Ozzy's existence. Conversely, Tony recalls a young Ozzy as being loud, wildly unreliable, and incessantly irritating. When the earliest iteration of Sabbath, then known as Earth, started to coalesce, Ozzy went out of his way to avoid Iommi. Butler later revealed a telling detail. Ozzy specifically approached him for a collaboration solely because he wanted to avoid working anywhere near Tony Iommi. That is the sheer scale of the divide between them. What ultimately bridged that gap wasn't a newfound friendship, but the undeniable power of sound. The moment Ozzy's voice met Tony's guitar, the atmosphere shifted. Ozzy didn't just sing on top of the music, he wove himself into it. He became a mirror to the melody, humming along with the riffs and tracing the sonic patterns. When lyrics failed him, he would mimic Tony's guitar lines vocally until the words eventually manifested. This raw, instinctive method is exactly what gifted Sabbath its hypnotic, doom-laden signature. Emotionally, they were oil and water, completely incompatible. Yet musically, they were a single organism. Tony was the methodical general, disciplined to a fault and obsessed with maintaining control over every note. Ozzy, on the other hand, was a force of pure chaos, impulsive, untamed, and operating entirely on gut feeling. That friction became the engine that drove Black Sabbath's early genius, but it was also the cancer eating away at the band's foundation. As their fame skyrocketed, the cracks in their relationship turned into chasms. Tony shouldered the heavy burden of leadership, managing the record labels, hitting the deadlines, and handling the crushing weight of expectations. Meanwhile, Ozzy was spiraling violently into substance abuse. By the late 1970s, the recording sessions had descended into absolute shambles. The guitar riffs continued to pile up, yet the songs themselves remained stagnant, going absolutely nowhere. Iommi has since confessed that Ozzy was frequently passed out on studio couches, physically present, but creatively vacant, forcing Tony to lie to record executives, swearing that progress was happening when the tapes were empty. By the time 1979 rolled around, the band had slammed into a breaking point from which there was no return. Tony, along with Geezer Butler and Bill Ward, made a ruthless decision that would alter the course of metal history. They didn't frame it as a punishment, they sold it as a necessary act of survival. Ozzy Osbourne was unceremoniously fired from Black Sabbath. To this day, Tony maintains it was a heartbreaking but collective choice made by the group. Ozzy, however, never bought that narrative for a second. In his mind, Tony was the grand architect of his exile, the man who chose the brand over the brotherhood. Years later, Ozzy would compare the sensation of being fired to being judged and hanged by a jury composed of killers. Sabbath wasn't merely a band to him, it was his entire identity, and Tony was the executioner who stripped it away. What made the betrayal sting even more was the aftermath. Tony didn't just move forward, he replaced Ozzy utilising Ozzy's future wife Sharon as the conduit. It was Tony who reached out to Ronnie James Dio, effectively rebuilding Sabbath from the ground up. The resulting album Heaven and Hell wasn't just a commercial success, it was a complete revitalisation of the band's spirit. Critics lauded the group's renewed focus and fans quickly embraced the darker, more epic fantasy sound. For Ozzy, watching this success from the sidelines was unforgivable. Tony stood victorious at the centre of it all, effectively proving that the true power of Sabbath lay in his riffs, not in Ozzy's voice. For his part, Tony didn't actively escalate the war of words. He remained pragmatic and business-focused. His logic was simple. The band had to survive and the music deserved to be heard. Ozzy had burned the bridges, so Tony simply built new ones. Yet the deep-seated resentment never truly faded. Even after Ozzy launched his own massive solo career, Tony remained a ghost, haunting the background of his success. The conflict eventually transitioned from personal to legal. In the early 2000s, Ozzy was blindsided to discover that Tony had formally registered the Black Sabbath trademark in the United States. A blizzard of lawsuits followed, with accusations flying back and forth. Everything from ownership rights to royalty checks and the band's legacy was up for dispute. It was about far more than just the money. It was a battle for custody over the history of heavy metal itself. For a long stretch, it appeared the relationship was permanently fractured. Then the death of Ronnie James Dio in 2010 shifted everyone's perspective. The lawsuits were quietly settled out of court and the public hostility began to soften significantly. Ozzy and Tony started communicating again, trading venom for restraint. Talks of a reunion began to circulate. They never became best friends, but they managed to broker a peace. Sabbath reunited for one final run. Albums were recorded, world tours were sold out, and Ozzy and Tony remained functional partners for the greater good of the legacy. It's important to note that Ozzy Osbourne didn't engage in feuds the way other rock stars did. He didn't collect enemies for the sport of it, nor did he thrive on rivalry. In fact, for the vast majority of his life, he actively avoided confrontation whenever possible. However, when a specific line was crossed, when his loyalty, respect, or personal dignity was violated, Ozzy possessed an elephant's memory. He didn't forget, and he certainly didn't forgive easily. That is the man behind the reality star persona. To truly understand the other conflicts on this list, you first have to understand Ozzy's unspoken code of honour. Ozzy emerged from the hard-knock streets of Aston, a world where unwavering loyalty was the absolute currency of survival. Growing up with next to nothing in a volatile environment, he was always the underdog, peering in from the cold, which shaped his entire worldview. The mates who stuck by his side when his pockets were empty were far more than just musical collaborators or business partners. In his eyes, they were his true kin, bound by a shared struggle that went deeper than blood ever could. Gaining entry to his inner circle meant you had a fierce protector for life, someone who would fight your corner against anyone, but God help you if you crossed him. Betrayal didn't just close the door, it welded it shut for eternity without a chance of parole. For him, there was a massive non-negotiable difference between screwing up in private and disrespecting him on the world stage. You could fail quietly and be forgiven, but public humiliation was a sin he simply could not abide. Whenever the public discusses the legend of Ozzy Osbourne, the conversation inevitably turns to the outrageous scandals and the sensational headlines. They tend to focus on the madness and the mayhem rather than the man himself. However, what the tabloids often miss is the profound personal impact these chaotic events actually had on his psyche. Out of all of the legendary battles he fought over the decades, which one do you reckon was the most damaging? We want to hear your opinions, so go ahead and leave your answer in the comments section below. Thank you so much for tuning in and spending your time with us today.